Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another in a series of events by the Michael V. Hayden Center at the Schar School here at George Mason University. And it's really wonderful to see many of you here in person. Over the past 3 years, we have built a very substantial following as well for our virtual events, oftentimes as many as several hundred or more attending virtually for those. But we decided to be back here at the Schar School in person, but also to provide the option for many of our regular viewers around the country and around the world, the online option. And so we're hybrid today. I think we'll continue to be hybrid because our supporters have all voted for that option, I think, and it seems to be working very well for them. So I also welcome all of those who are watching on our YouTube live stream. The live stream, of course, has the advantage of presenting our forums around the world, and signed up for our live stream tonight are viewers from multiple states, the District of Columbia, and multiple countries as well, and that's been quite typical for our events. And I know many of you are Hayden Center regulars, but for those of you who are new to these events, the center was founded 5 years ago by former NSA and CIA director and Schar School professor Michael V. Hayden. Like the Schar School generally, the center is nonpartisan and plays a very important role in elevating our understanding of a key area of policy and government. And with what is happening in the news very recently, of course, it may be an understatement to say that there really is a critical need to communicate the role and importance of intelligence to the nation's security, and that's exactly what we do. The Hayden Center has been a prominent voice in explaining and demystifying intelligence and security issues. So if you've missed some of our past programs, we have all of them on the Hayden Center website and on the YouTube channel. So I urge you to take a look at those. We've got many great programs in the past that are posted there. And related to the Hayden Center, we have a variety of high-impact centers at the Schar School, including our related Center on Security Policy Studies. And our graduate program in Security Studies has been a top 10 rated program nationally for 6 years in a row, for as long as we've had the program actually by U.S. News and World Report. Next fall, we're very excited about this. We inaugurate our new undergraduate degree program in international security and law, the very first of its kind. So thank you for attending, and I hope to see you at all of our future events here. And I now welcome to the stage the director of the Hayden Center, my colleague, Larry Pfeiffer. Larry.
Thank you all for coming. I know it's a busy time for students, and just generally it's always a busy time for everyone else. Mark did such a great job talking about what the Hayden Center does and what we're all about. I'm not going to spend much time adding to that. What I would note is that we are on a variety of social media platforms. If you'd like to follow us on those social media platforms, you'll learn about our events. You'll learn a lot about intelligence. We highlight things that are in the news about intelligence, that we kind of curate the best stuff. So please check us out on just about, we're not on Instagram and we're not on Snapchat, and you know we're not on TikTok. So, but we're most everywhere else. If you'd like to be the first one to ever know about a Hayden Center event coming up, you could register on our website. Go to haydencenter.gmu.edu. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a box. You put your email address, click the button, and you'll be added to our mailing list. And all we do is tell you about upcoming events. We don't sell your information. We don't bother you with spam. Tonight's event is going to be a great panel discussion here. But we will reserve some time for audience questions. So as you're listening to the event, think about questions you might want to ask. And our moderator will let you know when it's time to start lining up. We've got microphones on both sides of the seating area here. Just line up there, and the moderator will probably go back and forth between the sides. When you do ask your question, we'd love you to identify yourself. But if you want to remain anonymous, that's okay too. If you're a member of the press, we absolutely would love you to let us know that you're a member of the press. So please do that. In addition, we'd love it if you're in front of a microphone to ask a question, that you ask a question, and that you don't take a lot of time giving a speech. If you have something really important to say, save it for later when we're having a great reception afterwards. You can come up and talk to any of us and let us know your views on these issues. As Mark suggested, we like to try to demystify the role of intelligence with policymaking. at the Hayden Center. And there's probably no greater case study in how intelligence and policy intermingles in recent history than the role intelligence played in informing the policymakers who ultimately made the decision to go to war in Iraq. So tonight we've assembled an incredible panel here who were all in various places at that time playing critical roles to engage in a conversation about how that all played out. So quickly, working from the far end of the stage this way, moderating our event tonight is Ellen Lapson. Ellen is the director of the International Security Studies Program, Master's Program here at the Schar School, also runs the Center for Security Policy Studies, and does wonderful jobs. So if you're interested in coming to Mason to get a master's degree, talk to Ellen in the reception afterwards. But Ellen has got a storied career that includes a variety of things. I'll just highlight number one, that she was vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council. That's an organization once part of CIA, now part of the ODNI, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, that puts out intelligence community assessments on various issues. She's got a great background in Middle East issues. She led for many years the Stimson Center, one of the great think tanks in downtown Washington, as well. So thank you, Ellen, for agreeing to moderate our event. Next to Ellen, we have John McLaughlin, who's a wonderful, wonderful human being. I had the great pleasure of working directly for him when he was the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, and also Acting Director of Central Intelligence after George Tenet retired. He played an instrumental role in those early days in forming the Bush administration about not only the war on terror, but what was going on in Iraq, and he'll be able to offer a lot of great insights into how that played out. He's currently a professor at a competing institution. He's at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, sitting in one of their endowed chairs there. So welcome, John. Thank you for doing this. John doesn't get out here to talk about Iraq a lot. He did this just because I think he likes General Hayden, and so we really appreciate him coming out here as we discuss Iraq on its 20th anniversary. Next to him is General Hayden, our founder. General Hayden, as many of you know, served as director of CIA. He was director of NSA, the National Security Agency, during this time we went to war in Iraq, and can present some interesting thoughts on the perspective on the buildup to that war from a seat, 30 miles up the road in Maryland. Next to him is Charles Duelfer. Charlie is probably the world's greatest expert on Iraq weapons of mass destruction, or lack thereof. He served as the special advisor to the Director of Central Intelligence on Iraq, WMD. In that role, he led the Iraq Study Group that ultimately issued a report in October of 2004 and a declassified version of that report in 2005 that's available on the internet that ultimately informed our policy community that Iraq WMD thing wasn't quite the deal we thought it was. So Charlie, prior to that, had served on the UN Special Commission on Iraq, which was the Iraqi weapons mass destruction inspectors, spent a lot of time in Iraq in that role as well. And prior to that, had a time at State Department in arms control areas. So thank you, Charlie, for joining us. Next to Charlie is another great part of the Hayden Center, Michael Morrell, senior fellow at the Hayden Center. Michael served as deputy director of CIA, and during his tenure, twice served as acting director of CIA. I think you combined tenure as acting director might have been longer than some actual directors, but he served in key other roles at CIA as well. 33 year career at CIA. Michael's the author of a book about the war on terrorism, part of which focused very much on the war against ISIS in Iraq. And so, Michael was President Bush's President's Daily Briefer during those early days leading up to the war. And Michael also played an instrumental role in vetting the intelligence that was declassified and used by Secretary of State Colin Powell in his speech to the UN to try to persuade members of the UN to vote in favor of war in Iraq. So he can offer some great insights on how that played out as well. With that, I will turn it over to Ellen, and thank you all for your attention and look forward to your questions and join us afterwards for a great reception across the foyer there. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Larry. I'm really personally delighted to be back in a little reunion with folks who we worked together on Iraq matters over a period of years. But I also want to say that I'm very honored that in our audience is the former Iraqi ambassador to the United States, and he also served as Iraq's ambassador to the United Nations, Sumaida'ie. So I hope that we might ask you to share with us some Iraqi perspectives as well when we get to the question session. We'll defer to some of your insights about how this whole experience was absorbed by Iraqi society and as well as the Iraqi government. So I want to just introduce two ideas before we get started. One is, as I think Larry suggested, the Iraq War is not just another regional conflict where the United States went there and then came home again. The Iraq War really represents a very compelling and very controversial incident in American history that will continue to be studied. Its consequences, whether they were intended or unintended consequences, are still causing ripple effects in both the Middle East region, but in international relations more generally. In the opinion of some, the Iraq War was unintentionally the end of the era of the America as a single superpower, whether it was our relations with allies or with the countries in the Middle East region, things changed because of the Iraq War. It was a formative experience for a whole generation of intelligence officers, diplomats, members of the armed forces, journalists, humanitarian workers. It really is a major event in American history as far as I'm concerned, and should not be, we don't want to compare it to much, conflicts where the United States intervention was of less lasting consequence than Iraq. So first, it's the historical gravity of this story. Second is that intelligence was exceptionally important in several decades of US policy towards Iraq. And it's because it's a hard target. It's because the intelligence plays a disproportionate role in places where the other tools of American policy, diplomacy, people-to-people culture, military-to-military relations, are absent because we have no access to a particular country. So Iraq is one of those exceptional cases, perhaps comparable to North Korea, where the burden on intelligence to figure out how to learn what was going on in this place, both before the war and certainly once we were on the ground there, was quite exceptional. And so I thought one way that we might start our conversation is to turn to John McLaughlin and General Hayden, who were looking at Iraq from a very senior leadership position. And I would ask you to help us understand how the intelligence community and the system looks at these hard targets, where intelligence alone is working the problem, that almost no other aspects of the national security community can do as much as intelligence can do. How did you think about that in terms of setting priorities, allocating resources, et cetera? And to get us closer to the Iraq story, when a new administration comes into office and has a different set of priorities, when you're sitting in the intelligence leadership position, how do you get the balance between what the intel professionals are working on and what the new administration says is their priority? So just a sort of broader framing, if you will, to get us started.
Yeah.
John, would you like to go first?
Well, thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Larry. I'll come here anytime I'm introduced as a wonderful human being. I've never had that appellation before. So this is a tough question. I'm sure General Hayden and I both have views on this. First off, you were correct in saying something like Iraq was what we call a hard target, and we put that in quotation marks. Hard meaning, along with North Korea, Iraq, Iran, today you might include, of course, China, Russia, places where we don't have a lot of access, where countries have a degree of hostility toward us, where deception is involved, and where people are trained to resist recruitment by intelligence officers, and where they are very skillful at eluding the kind of collection techniques we use, and where they're very important. All of those things make them hard targets. Now, there are not soft or easy targets in the intelligence world, but there are some that are easier. These are hard. And so I think the main thing is you have to use the word priorities. You have to establish priorities. In the case of Iraq, for example, looking back to that time, we had very good insight into Iraq up through the 1990s, I would say till about 1998, in part because there were UN weapons inspectors on the ground there. And we were learning what they reported, and we had perfect insight into that. In 1998, they had to leave for a variety of reasons we can go into. And we lost some of that visibility. Because generally people thought we knew a lot about Iraq based on that, we really put a lot of priority on things like North Korea and things like Iran. And tellingly, I can elaborate later, we did pretty well on North Korea and Iran, particularly on North Korea, and can give you the chapter and verse on that. But that was one way in which, and on Iraq itself, our priority at that time was really on protecting the pilots who were flying what we called the no-fly zones in the north and south. Saddam was attacking the Shia in the south, the Kurds in the north, and Allied pilots from the UK, United States, France, and others were flying missions to deny Saddam Hussein air superiority in those regions, to keep his helicopters off the air and so forth. So our priorities there were set that way, which explains some of what happened in Iraq. On your second question, how do you adjust to a new administration when one administration has a lot of certain priorities? It is a balance. You used the word balance. Inevitably, intelligence officers have their own views of what's important and what we need to be out collecting. Why? Because they're doing the work every day and they know what they don't know, and therefore they know what they need, so they have a view on what we need to go get. But a new administration comes in and they have different priorities, and you have to adjust. Because ultimately you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing it to give policymakers decision advantage. You're doing it so they can make decisions. Intelligence doesn't make policy, it informs policy. So to go to the Iraq case, well, it's a little different because the Clinton administration also put a high priority on Iraq. Remember, the Congress had passed legislation saying that there ought to be a certain amount of money allocated to getting rid of Saddam. So there was a very anti-Iraq attitude in the Clinton administration. What changed, I think, in the Bush administration, and we had to recognize this, was that there was an even higher priority on Iraq. The piece of data I would bring to that is that the very first meeting of the national security principals in the Bush administration, principals meaning Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, Joint Chiefs of Staff, the big officers in the White House Situation Room with the president, the very first meeting was on Iraq. And George Tenet happened to be out of town, and I had to go to that meeting, which is how I know this. And so I was struck right then. First meeting of the national security team, and it's on Iraq. There's a message, isn't it? So it doesn't mean that you don't do other things, but it means they're interested in Iraq. So get ready for them to be asking questions about Iraq. And yet it has to be a balance, and you're not taking orders, but you are paying attention to what they think they need. And that's been true in every administration I've been in. Give you one example, when Jimmy Carter came to office, he made human rights and intelligence collection priority, which it had not been up till then. And every president has, and you can imagine, Ronald Reagan had very specific requirements for Russia. So I've gone on too long, but that would be my take on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
General Hayden, you served in so many parts of the intelligence senior leadership. So any insights on this hard target problem?
Well, it's First of all, I have aphasia, so occasionally it's a little bit hard for me. But now, talking about that, I was at NSA, okay? And so I was doing something at Fort Meade, not in the in CIA, all right? And so I was called, and we had a meeting, remember, about weapons of mass destruction. And we were there maybe 4 or 5 hours talking about that, you know? And by and large, the people in the meeting said, yeah, Saddam has weapons of mass destruction, all right? Now, we said, we don't know. It's hard for me to say, but if you ask me, yes, I think they have them. And we should have been better than that, because it's very important. They said, we think they have them, but we don't know. And that was a real problem. Now, later on, when we were going to war, okay, I know that we were going to war because the United States troops were now involved, and it was 1, 2, 3 months before the war. But I said, no, we're going to war, okay? So I called a meeting 1, 2, 3, 4 times for people at CIA, or NSA, okay? Saying, we're going to war, okay? And what I was going to say was, I did it 4 different times because I wanted to know that people were going to war, okay? In my book, I talk about this, and I say, we're going to war. I'm not sure why we're doing it, but we're going to war.
Thank you. So our conversation tonight is framed as the 20th anniversary of, obviously, the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq. But the Iraq story, we really have to see it as a series of chapters. So there was the Gulf War from 90 to 91, led by President George H.W. Bush. There was the decade of the 90s, which was mostly sanctions and looking for WMD. And then there was the Bush 43 administration and the story that begins the 20-year trajectory. Charlie, you were involved in lots of different pieces of this narrative of Iraq, both at the State Department, at UNSCOM, and then leading the survey group. And so I think you are so uniquely qualified to help us understand what it was like on the ground to be trying to answer this big both policy and intel collection question on Iraqi WMD. So you can start at any point in this chronology that you want, but it would be really helpful to hear from you about the methodologies, the challenges, how the Iraqis behaved when we were doing those inspections, to give people a sense of what some of the obstacles to getting the definitive answer to that question were.
Thank you, Ellen. And let me just say, it's a pleasure to be surrounded by colleagues who have supported my little piece of this endeavor for so long with such an earnest and unbiased support. I don't think many people would do this, but I think I can probably take credit for playing the most important role in creating the bias that everybody assumed that Saddam would be crazy not to have WMD. And the reason I say that is I spent a lot of time at the UN. We were doing inspections, and for a lot of reasons, we were collecting a lot of data in a process which caused us to what I would call there was a negative feedback loop in terms of how close the Iraq regime was to telling the truth and our propensity to believe it. when people were making the assessments in 2002, in advance of going to war, as the general said, and the analysts, policymakers, not just in the United States, but around the world, all had a very strong predisposition and a bias to think, well, Saddam would be crazy not to have WMD. And that those mindsets don't just come about overnight. So I'm going to take a second to back up, not to Paleolithic times, but one decade before you started, Ellen, because my first experience with Iraq was in the 80s when Saddam had come to power in 1979. One of the first things he wound up doing was going to war with Iran. And it was the Iran-Iraq War. There was, at that time, there was no CWC. Iran started applying something called human wave attacks. And it was quite effective against Iraq. They were pushing back Iraqi forces. Well, what is a perfect counter to that was chemical weapons. Saddam Hussein, Iraq, used 101,000 chemical munitions during the Iran-Iraq War. It worked great for him. That war ended in 1988. Between that period and the next war, he goes into Kuwait. And I'm very good at making the Saddam argument because we spent a lot of time debriefing him and all this stuff. And from his perspective, that wasn't quite as nutty a decision as you might think, but that's not what you asked. But in any case, so then in the Kuwait War, he goes in, and he still had stocks of chemical munitions, ballistic missiles to deliver them, and a nascent biological weapons program, and a nuclear program which was more advanced than the United States intelligence community thought at that time. He goes into Kuwait, he's expelled, but he was not, Bush the elder did not go beyond expelling him from Kuwait. He did not go to Baghdad. From discussions with Saddam, in Saddam's mind, contributing to the decision for the Americans not to go to Baghdad in 1991 was the deterrent value of his WMD. So now Saddam has two cases where WMD was important to the survival of his regime. Then from post-Kuwait War, the United Nations Security Council said, okay, we're going to keep sanctions on Saddam. From the American perspective, this was vital to the policy of containing Saddam. But the resolution said, sanctions, the embargo will stay on until and unless a new organization, which they called UNSCOM, today it sounds like, I don't know, somebody you can clean the toilet with, but it stood for UN Special Commission on Iraq, weapons inspectors who basically could do whatever they wanted to collect information, to interview people, take stuff in, take stuff out. We could do whatever we wanted so long as we could, A, verifiably account what happened to the Iraqi infrastructure on WMD and put in place a monitoring system. I'm going to take it just 1 second longer to step into Saddam's mind. Saddam, very early in this process, when the resolution was passed, he sits with his RCC, the Revolutionary Command Council. It's like Saddam at one end and these bobbleheads around him. And they start discussing, what do we do? There's this UN thing and the weapons inspectors. We don't know what that's all about. So they had a long discussion. We have the recordings of this, so I'm not making this up. You can test this. But they discussed this, and I said, well, look, we don't know what these guys are going to do, but we want this to be as quick as possible. He had a working assumption that things would revert to the norm, not illogical. So in other words, he wanted to get back to doing business as usual. And he wanted to, since the weapons inspectors are what stood between him and that, said, well, let's make it as simple as possible. Give him the obvious stuff. Give him the ballistic missiles, which everyone knew he had, Scud missiles. Give him the chemical weapons, everyone knew he has. But don't confuse the issue with anything else. So he started with a lie, but in a way understandable. But from that point forward, the weapons inspectors had to keep prying away because we would keep learning little bits and things that didn't add up. And we, subsequently eventually learned that he had a biological weapons program, et cetera. That took place over years. And so when I say there was a negative feedback loop, gradually, Saddam was giving, more truth until the point to 1997, 1998. He basically he'd account for the bulk of his stuff. But the process of giving it up was always another lie we were uncovering. And so our tolerance, to give him the benefit of the doubt, the truth quotient was going up, but the trust quotient was going down. And that permeated not just the weapons inspectors, but the people who read in great earnestness, Americans, everyone else. And so by the time we left in 1998, there was the taste was, well, why would he give this stuff up? He's been cheating for so long. We, UNSCOM, could demonstrate that there were gaps in knowledge, that there were things which he had not accounted for. We could demonstrate that there were certain things that he lied about, but we weren't willing to say, well, maybe there's a reason for that. And one final point, from 1998 on, until the war, we had enormous data when UNSCOM, we went all over Iraq. We were interviewing people, going to palaces, all kinds of, everything you can imagine in terms of trying to solve that problem and collect on, we did. Some of them did not seem very UN-like. But when we left, the intelligence community, and this is slightly overstated, was largely blind. But the requirement to come up with assessments didn't go away. And like so many other intelligence issues, the hard targets, the hard issues are the ones you have the least data on. And so you're still, President wants an assessment. Says, well, okay, well, what do you tell me what you think. We're going to war. Are our troops going to have to face chemical or biological munitions? So if you're an analyst and you've got no new data from 1998 on, and as it turns out, the UNSCOM data, we did much better than we knew in terms of accounting for things. And you've got a few data points. Do you draw the curve going, up, sideways, down? You can draw the connections almost any way. One last point. When you have very little data, each data point acquires importance beyond perhaps its real value. And we became very vulnerable to fabricators. There's a famous case, in the shrunken universe of Iraq, but a guy named Curveball, which was, should have been known to be fabricated. Anyway, I'll stop there.
But before I turn to Michael, if you could just fill in a little bit, 2 sentences on what you knew, how close did you get to the nuclear program? And what was the understanding in the 90s up until UNSCOM was kicked out of what the status of that program was?
In 1991, before the Kuwait War, our assessment was that they were, I think, 8 years away. The Israelis had an assessment which was they were much closer. And it turned out that because they had a reactor there, they could have assembled a very rudimentary bomb because they could have enough fissile material, gathered together and driven it in a truck someplace. Between then and when UNSCOM was completing its work, they did virtually nothing. But we did uncover a lot of their details, the weapons design, where all the facilities were, all the things which were associated with it, which was extremely extensive. But the most serious thing we could conclude was that they were retaining the intellectual capital as much as possible. And I should hasten to add, Iraq's decision, as we unearthed it in 2003, 4, after the war, was, yes, Saddam had given up this stuff, but he had every intention of reconstituting those programs when circumstances permitted. And he had specific plans for that. The nuclear stuff was distant, but chemical and biological was certainly much more proximate. In the case of chemical, maybe 6 months. Biology, because of its nature, and you've got a great, study group here on that. It's relatively easy. Sorry for droning on.
Thank you. No, that's great. So, Michael, you're on the receiving end of this collection coming out from UNSCOM and whatever other sources are available. And you really get the heart of the story here. If you could help us understand from your perspective, leading analysis, getting into the Oval Office to understand what the president wants, help us fill out the story of particularly the acute period of the war, the buildup, the decision to go to war, and the immediate implementation of Bush's policy in 2003. What level of confidence in the assessments that were being produced, and tell us, and perhaps share with us that Intel policy interface and how the Intel product production, if you will, was contributing to the policymakers' decision chain.
Yeah. Maybe I could start by just making a couple comments on what's already been said, because I think it's important. One is John mentioned that the Congress passed a resolution, calling for U.S. policy to be the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. I can say this because it's been declassified, but there was actually a covert action finding signed by President Clinton telling CIA to actually make that happen. And I raise that because I think part of the story of us not collecting what was really happening on the WMD programs was the fact that we were focused on trying to find a set of Sunni generals who would be willing to overthrow Saddam. And I think that's the specific point. The general point is covert action often comes at a significant cost. Congress typically gives you money for covert actions, but doesn't give you additional people, particularly people with expertise. And so it's your operations officers, and in some cases your analysts, who are actually conducting this covert action, and because they're doing that, they're not doing something else. And in the case of Iraq, it was focusing on one thing rather than another. And so I think that was an important part of the story of the lack of collection being what it needed to be, and I just wanted to put that on the table. Look, I thought about this a lot. I've talked to a lot of the analysts involved in this. This happened 2/3 of the way through my career, and so I had another third to go with this intelligence failure, behind me. So a lot of discussions, a lot of reading while I was still there. I believe to this day that based on the information that the analysts had, and if I brought it into the room right now and put it in a big pile and had you go through it and you didn't know what the true answer is, you would come to the same conclusion the analysts came to. They came to the logical conclusion based on the information that was sitting in front of them. The mistake they made was the mistake that General Hayden pointed out. In the national intelligence estimate that said they have chemical weapons, they have biological weapons, and they are reconstituting their nuclear weapons program, the analysts said they had high confidence in all three of those things. That's the mistake they made. If they had really thought about it and really looked at most of the data dated back to 1998. Most of the data was 5 years old. Much of it was circumstantial. Some of it was direct, but most of it was circumstantial. And that a big part of their view that he had it was based on history, the history that Charles just gave you, right? They should have said, we have low confidence, not high. And it would have been a very different message, I think, to President Bush to walk into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, we think he has these weapons and we have high confidence in that. And walking in the Oval Office and saying, Mr. President, we think he has these weapons, but what you really need to know is that we only have low confidence. I think that's the mistake that was made. And I think the big learning that came out of this for analysts was to take seriously and to give as much thought to your confidence level as you give to your judgment. And post-Iraq, that became part of the culture. It became part of the culture in the analytic community, and it became part of the culture in the discussion with policymakers. Deep into the Obama administration, judgment, confidence level. And maybe I'll stop there. And did I miss anything?
No. but I'd like to pose another follow-on question. I appreciate that WMD was certainly the issue that really, I think, could persuade more people, both in the US and overseas, that Saddam posed a national security threat. There were other parts of the Iraq story, though, that analysts were also struggling to answer. So, Michael, I wonder if you could say, you said, looking for alternatives to Saddam, that was a big effort. But what about what the analytic judgments were of how Iraqis were likely to respond to the U.S. intervention?
So, I mean, so we got WMD wrong. I mean, absolutely got it wrong. Failed on collection, failed on analysis. That's where the Iraq story ends, I think, for many people when they think about Iraq and the intelligence community. And the fact is, and I did a whole podcast on this, but the fact is there were a lot of other pieces that we got right. One of the big questions was Iraq and terrorism. Iraq had a long history of providing support to, funding for, training for, safe haven for Palestinian terrorist groups. One of the issues that President Bush was deeply concerned about was Saddam giving these weapons of mass destruction that everybody thought he had to terrorist groups, namely Al-Qaeda. And so one of the big questions that John will remember and General Hayden will remember is, was there a relationship between Saddam and Al-Qaeda? And we looked at that question from every possible angle, and we came to the conclusion, no. There were some early contacts between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, but there was no relationship, there was no operational relationship, there was no Iraqi involvement in 9/11, there was no Iraqi foreknowledge of 9/11, there was none of that. And we said that as clearly as I just said it. And when we got inside of Iraq, we learned that not only was that correct, but that we actually overstated some of the early contacts between the two groups. We actually got that wrong. So that was one thing we got right. Another thing we got right was, prior to the war, we were deeply concerned about the stability of Iraq post-invasion. And a number of our analysts wrote about and briefed their deep concerns about whether Iraqi society would hold together in the aftermath of an invasion. I could give you the title of the papers and you'd nod your head up and down. And it's exactly what happened post-invasion. One of the things that we were concerned about analytically prior to the invasion was the discussion that was going on in the administration about de-Baathification, about taking anybody who had been a member of the Ba'ath Party and telling them you can't be part of the new government or you can't be part of the military. So it was a discussion that happened prior to the war. And our analysts said any sort of de-Baathification can be very dangerous because you're not going to be left with very many people, because many, many people were members of the Ba'ath Party. You had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party to get a job. It was a way to get ahead in Iraqi society as well. So deep concern about that prior to the war. And then some things after the war that we can get to if you want.
Great, thank you. I want to give people a 5-minute warning. You can, if you have a question you'd like to pose, there are microphones on both sides of the room, so I'll give you a chance to organize your thoughts here. A couple of other issues. Charlie, I'd like to go back to the notion that you were working for the UN, multilateral institution. Your inspectors were people of diverse nationalities. How did UNSCOM share its knowledge? Was it to the all the member states of the UN? Was it to the Security Council? And whether that sharing of UNSCOM's reporting to lots and lots of countries, did that diminish the credence or the weight that American intel folks would place on that information? So it's kind of the cultural interaction between UNSCOM and the US a little bit.
That's a good question, and having spent time at the UN, you'll appreciate I'll have a couple of aspects of my answer. One, we published every 3 months for a while, every 6 months for another period, detailed reports about what our inspectors did in various locations, which were, open to the planet. We were a unique organization within the UN structure in that we reported directly to the Security Council. That was unusual. Most UN organizations report to the Secretary General through the normal process, but our boss was the Security Council, which had its upsides and downsides. It's like, you've got who was that? There was a famous person who had a multiple personality disorder. I think, what was her name? Anyway, Sybil, yes, it's like having Sybil for your boss. Because, there are 15 people on the Security Council, all of whom, they may have been united at one moment in time when they voted to pass the resolutions under which we operated. But from that moment later, there was a tendency for their interests and priorities to diverge. But anyway, so we reported orally to that group. But I think another aspect of your question, Lil, is we were, and this doesn't sound good in a UN context, but we were a small intelligence operation organized around one specific mission that the Security Council agreed upon. We were collectors, we were analysts, we were reports officers, we were sources, and we were a sponge which took up data, not just from Iraq, but from any country which would provide it. The United States was a very generous provider of both technical assistance, information. They flew a U-2. We had a U-2 with a little UN thing on the back of it, and we collected a lot of data. As a method of operation, we had to decide, okay, well, in our bilateral informal discussions with other countries, who do we tell what to?
Right.
And my boss at the time, a Swede, Rolf Ekéus, I was the deputy, and he was the Swede. He set a procedure, a rule that so those countries which help us, we will tell them more so that they can help us, and that's turned out to be a fairly useful guideline, and it gave us some cover. One of the other aspects we had to concern ourselves with was the material that we were dealing with was nuclear weapons design. How do you produce VX? All kinds of biological. So we needed experts who knew on this stuff, and the number of countries whom we could draw expertise from is fairly limited. By the same token, we didn't want to become a source of proliferation. So we didn't want to tell a lot of people stuff. Well, if you're going to have a flying plate or this or that, beryllium, something, nuclear weapon, it's not going to work so good. So we were kind of constrained in that way. But like many things at the UN, it's there aren't firm rules on it, and we had to manage that. But I think we kind of did okay for a while.
Thank you. So I wonder if John or General Hayden would like to jump in on this question of liaison relationships during the whole long Iraq saga. How much did the allies in coalition warfare rely on you, come to you for support? Were there unique mechanisms that were put in place for intelligence sharing that you recall? Or was that kind of handled out in the field? Just curious if you have any reminiscences about liaison sharing during the Iraq War.
Well, for me, our sharing was very good. Even the Germans, they had a problem.
With one source.
Yes, well, yes, but also they're saying, I don't think you could do that. But BND was wonderful for us, So, no, we were okay. By the way, when we thought that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, they did too, okay? All of us did,
Yeah, I think a couple of thoughts on that. If you go back into the 90s, let's say, before the war, one of the jobs that most people don't know about that I think also influenced the thinking of experts at the CIA was that based on the information that the UN had produced, I remember if you go back to the mid-1990s, there was not only a conviction that Saddam had WMD, we had found it. It was being recovered. And against that backdrop, intelligence officers from actually the National Intelligence Council, where you ultimately were the vice chairman, were often detailed around the time that a new group of members were coming on to the Security Council, rotating on. There are a number who rotate on as opposed to the permanent members. And intelligence officers would be asked to go up to the Security Council and brief them on Iraq, so that they could be aware of what we thought we knew and that they would then vote for sanctions, to continue sanctions. So that's one way in which we interacted with other countries, but it also ground into the belief network, if you will, among some senior experts that, well, Saddam must have this stuff because we're briefing on it all the time, and we're basing the briefings on material that we knew to exist. This is before the war now, well before the war, when UNSCOM, when the UN was discovering this stuff. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is, as the war approached, and like General Hayden, there was a certain point where I could say, yeah, we're going to war. But I have to say, up until the very last minute, I thought there was a case to be made for not going to war. In March, for example, the war began in March 19th of 2003. In early March, the UN organization of that time, which was called what? UNMOVIC?
UNMOVIC.
Was the next iteration.
We used to call it UNMOVIC.
Okay, well, the next UN inspection organization had conducted about 500 inspections pretty successfully, and Saddam was turning over certain of his missiles to the UN for destruction. So he was obviously concerned at this point. And I remember going into our chief of staff at the time and saying, John, this war might not happen because something's going on in the inspection process. And that's one of those little footnotes on it. But once it was clear that the war was going to go forward, and even in the period when people were trying to figure out what's the story on WMD, we were in touch with other intelligence services, principally the British. And they've had their own Iraq inquiry, by the way, looking back at what happened and what didn't happen, what went wrong. We're in touch with the French, the Germans, others in Europe in particular, mainly in Europe. And I don't recall that any of them thought Saddam didn't have WMD.
Right.
The only difference was a lot of them, say the French, thought this wasn't to go to war over. So there were differences at the political level between our administration and, say, the French leadership about the merits of war. They opposed it. And the Germans, for that matter, I don't know how overtly, but they certainly didn't relish the idea. As everyone will remember, the British Prime Minister supported the president in the war effort. So yes, there was exchanges of information, and I have to say, another little-known aspect of all of this, and by the way, you shouldn't interpret anything we say as defensive or justifying. Whoever said it here, Charlie or the general, or whoever said it, is you got to make that point right at the beginning. It was an intelligence failure, so you don't apologize for that. I mean, you try and figure out what went wrong and you fix it. So none of what we're saying is to be taken as defensive. But the point I was going to make is that much of the information we received from foreign intelligence was very confirmatory, in our minds, what we were receiving was very confirmatory of the existence of WMD. And there were moments when I would sit down with a foreign intelligence service chief and say, are you sure you're right here? Because the President of the United States is taking seriously what you're giving us, because we're giving it to him and he's taking it seriously. And in every case, I was assured that we were on solid ground. So again, I don't recall a foreign intelligence service that said to us, no, he doesn't have WMD.
One thing that, Samir, I don't know if can we call on you in a few minutes? Would you be willing to say a few words? If you have to. Okay. Adeline, I wonder if we could bring him a mic. Is that mic portable? But I wanted to just bring in the factor that hasn't come up yet, that the Defense Department was very forward-leaning with enthusiasm, very politically engaged with President Bush's, clear intention to go to war, and they were producing their own analysis. So I wonder if
Really?
either of you...
Did they do that? Oh, my.
So, Michael, I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot here, but was there any interaction between the sort of career professional analysts and these cells within the Defense Department that were generating almost competing analysis, if you will?
No,
Was there?
no.
Like-
There
We
wasn't.
didn't even know about it.
We didn't even know about it. No. It's not like they came to us and said, we have a different view, let's talk about it. We didn't even know they were doing it. They were just doing their own analysis and sharing that analysis with the White House.
Charlie, you have? Yeah.
Well, I knew about it, but that was a different position. But the point I wanted to make is just to remind the context at the time. 9/11 was still
Yes.
fresh.
Fair
and
point.
I'm probably the wrong person to make this point, but the president, had been shocked early in his administration. He'd been attacked. He thought he was going to be a domestic policy president. The United States was attacked. Risk tolerance was very low. I mean, it's hard to remember now, F-16s flying over the Capitol. These guys woke up every day convinced there was going to be a
Be
second
another
wave
attack.
of attacks, any second. And that shaped, I think,
Yeah.
the thinking, the collection, the policymakers about Iraq.
I think also, when I was at NSA, okay, and all the time, the phone rang for the Secretary of Defense. What about this? What about that? What about that? And I'm saying, no, 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 no. But it happened all the time.
Yes, please,
So
Michael.
I thought you were going to go in a different direction with regard to the Defense Department. And the point I want to make about that, where I thought you were going to go, Ellen, was the seniors at the Defense Department made multiple arguments
Yes.
for why we needed to go to war.
Yes. Yes.
And weapons of mass destruction
Was
were
only
just
one.
one of those.
Right.
Yep.
One argument was, we had to reestablish ourselves as the hegemony in the world post 9/11.
Yes.
Another argument was we need a model in the Middle East of a democratic state, and Iraq is that state to turn into that model, right? Out of which there will be no terrorism. So there were multiple arguments made, largely out of the Defense Department, about why we needed to go to war. And had we gotten the analysis right, from my perspective, which is, Mr. President, we think he has it, but you need to know only low confidence, we may still have gone to war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, very interesting. And I appreciate Charlie also reminding us that the country was still, in a way, in a traumatic state. But as you said, John, they had a meeting on Iraq before 9/11 happened. So there was an Iraq, predilection, and then 9/11 happened, and then it. So the analysis that we've heard since during this 20th anniversary season, if you will, the combination of both fear and the desire to reassert American primacy was happening, and that the message for some in the national security establishment was Iraq was just a convenient place to make that point. For others, it was Iraq. It was Iraq as Iraq that was the target. But
There's another factor, too. Agreeing with everything that's been said, remember, our initial conflict with Afghanistan had occurred just before. And even though Afghanistan obviously didn't turn out as everyone hoped, just going back to the withdrawal and so forth, in those early days, I often say we actually won in Afghanistan
Yes.
twice.
That's right.
In those early days, it went very well.
Yeah.
CIA had teams on the ground in Afghanistan 15 days after 9/11. And by November, Kabul had fallen, the Taliban was vanquished, the Al-Qaeda was spreading, and in the next year, we basically captured or killed most of the 9/11 era leadership of Al-Qaeda. So there was a sense, not in the CIA per se, but in the US government generally, among the policy world, well, we'd done pretty well in Afghanistan, and it didn't cost us a lot. And
So Iraq will be easy. Yeah.
well, some, and
Yeah.
we didn't think Iraq would be easy, but there were people in the administration who thought we would be welcomed as liberators. Initially we were, but it didn't last very long. To elaborate on something Michael was saying, and it came from actually your former organization, the National Security Council. I remember quite vividly in January, so the war began in March. In January, we delivered 2 papers from the National Intelligence Council. Paul Pillar wrote them, and one of them said, if there's a prolonged occupation in Iraq, there will be violence and instability well beyond anything imagined today. And the other paper said something comparable about the region. So we had no illusions about the difficulty of doing this in Iraq. But I don't think those were widely shared views. And frankly, you know, intelligence people always can look back at something we produced that should have been taken as a warning. But frankly, those papers were often late. The war began in March. Giving them those papers in January, things were already pretty far forward mobilized.
Yeah. And that's how I feel about it. I was in Paul's position back in the first Gulf War, and we were producing a lot of analysis in the fall, and you kind of had the feeling you were writing for the history books because the decision had already been made.
Yeah.
You know, that it was more likely than not that Saddam was not going to be persuaded to get out of Kuwait, short of us going after him. We actually wrote an estimate that said he could blink, and DIA was the one part of the intelligence community said, nope, he won't believe we're going to hit him until we hit him. That was their view. So I just think we have the privilege of having a very distinguished Iraqi with us tonight, and I wondered if you want to share any reflections, agree or disagree with anything that's been said.
Well, thank you very much. I have actually learned quite a lot in listening to the discussion. Here we have a superpower, which at that time was perceived and was actually the unique superpower in the world, willing to create a change, create a democratic model in the Middle East, in its image. And here we are, 20 years from that time, looking at the result, which is as far as you can imagine from that objective. What I've learned today is actually a lot of bits and pieces. When we add them together, we see the gaps, and we see how gaps in intelligence, gaps in communication between the intelligence community and the policymakers, the policymakers' decisions, and then the implementation of the policy. This chain is full of gaps, full of pitfalls. I paid attention to the comments by Michael, the tension between judgment and confidence. That's something which is important. Then the gap, the assumption to extrapolate when you should not be extrapolating, when a data point is given more weight than it should have. Then you mentioned also the policy recommendations against de-Baathifications, for example, which was not heeded. And further along, we have the situation where the policymakers wanted to have that war. They were focused on Iraq. They wanted to do, and they picked the bits of intelligence which fitted with what they wanted to do, and then proceeded to do that. And then when they did, then the way it was managed, we were at the receiving end in Iraq. And we saw in the early days what I called the tribal warfare between the Pentagon people and the State Department people. a lot of the energy of the early Americans who came into Iraq went into that kind of conflict. The study groups which were formed before the invasion in the United States, with the participation of a lot of us who were at that time in the opposition, formulated recommendations. But that was run by the State Department. When Pentagon took charge, that was relegated to, it was put on the shelf. Mm-hmm. And I can continue. I don't want to take more time than the result of all this is basically a catastrophe. It's chaos. It was not executed in such a way that is based on firm knowledge, understanding the complexity of the situation, and preparing for the correct measures. One of the worst things, apart from the de-Baathification program, was declaring this to be an invasion, an occupation. Mm-hmm. Now that immediately put people like me as traitors. I mean, we are collaborating with the occupier. And we became targets of the so-called insurrectionists and the resistance fighters. So I don't want to take longer, but what I've learned this evening is very important. Gaps along this chain, which starts with a vision which sounds and looks attractive and ends in a disaster. These gaps, when you put them together next to each other, you can understand what happened. In Iraq now, most people believe, how can a superpower fail so much? It must be intentional. They came to destroy Iraq, and they did.
Thank you so much. Those somber notes, yes. I want to encourage people in the audience to get ready for a question, and we have Professor Piffner, who's written a lot on American presidents in Iraq. I hope that you might join the conversation as well. Okay, why don't we, this line is a little longer, so we'll start with this side. Please, if you can, introduce yourself.
My name is Sufyan Jamukov. I'm Associate Research Professor at George Washington University. And my question is to Mr. McLaughlin. Actually, two questions. You mentioned, and also several others mentioned, that there were a number of factors for the war. One was weapon of mass destructions. Another one is this democratic dream of spreading democracy, and like others. Also, there were other agencies involved in the discussion. And my first question is why it turned out that it was actually the intelligence community that was blamed. And coming from the logic, actually, one of the ideas was that if Iraq would possess weapon of mass destruction, that would actually be a factor dangerous for invasion, because our soldiers would be in danger. So invasion was in part in spite of thinking that Iraq had a weapon of mass. And my second question is that when we talk about this war, all we hear is a negative assessment of the outcome of the war. And I wonder if there is anything positive about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please. Yeah, I'll try and be brief because we have so many people lined up. If I understood the two questions, one was, why is it that intelligence took the blame? Well, the short answer would be, when Bob Gates was once asked if they would ever abolish the CIA, he said, hell no, there'd be no one left to blame. And so I say that not entirely facetiously, but the point is, the more important point is, I've said this publicly before, everyone needs to stop blaming everyone else for Iraq because everyone made mistakes on Iraq, everyone. The difference with the intelligence community is we really went to school on the mistakes. The war began in March of '03. By June, we knew something was wrong. We weren't finding what everyone anticipated. So we put together a team that worked until February, some of our best people, to figure out what had gone wrong. And by February, we had our own report written up on all of the things that had gone wrong and what we needed to do to fix it. So I can elaborate, but I would stop there on that point. Point is, we took it seriously, and I think you could say, I know Michael will agree, that much of what occurred successfully after this failure resulted from the changes we made in response to this failure. And we could all give you examples of that. Your second question was,
Was anything successful?
well, was anything successful? Michael mentioned a couple of things. I would say on the intelligence side, yes. I recall doing the briefing myself in the Situation Room. When the insurgency began to develop, we defined it right away as an insurgency, and it took a long time, I would say 6 months, before the government as a whole said, yes, this is an insurgency. It's not just a small problem, it's going to be a serious insurgency. But on the broader issue of whether anything good comes of it, I said to one of my students today, I don't think we'll know what this means for another 20, 30, 40 years until we see how Iraq evolves over time. I'll just leave it at that.
Can I just add one thing to your first question? I am still waiting for a definitive study of what happened on the policy side. There have been many studies of what happened on the intelligence side. I'm still waiting for the study on the policy side.
And that does get to our political culture, that the permanent institution of intelligence has a capacity to to go back and do tough-minded assessments. The political class leaves. The people that would be most accountable, it's at the ballot box that we decide whether we want them to keep doing their jobs or not. So the truth is, there isn't that much of a mechanism for the same accountability.
But take Russia's interference in the 2016 elections. The SSCI, the Senate Intelligence Committee, did a deep study of that, and one of the volumes was the policy response to it. Right. So there can be studies on policy.
Okay. Given how long the lines are, I'm just going to really implore you a very succinct question and one question only per person. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. My one question. So in '93, Senator Regal published a report that provided evidence of chemical and biological weapons that were used in theater in the '91 war. Given that, do you know why the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration did not support the soldiers in getting health care around Gulf War syndrome?
I can talk a bit about that. I mean,
Sure.
there was I think you're referring to as Gulf War syndrome. We, UNSCOM, and through the U.S. mission, provided a lot of data on that. We collected data at a place called Kamassia, which was a weapons depot, which the American forces blew up thinking it was conventional weapons, and it turned out it had sarin in it, and studied the plume and the possible exposures, all those sorts of things. It took way too long to get to that point. President Clinton, initially started feeling political pressure from veterans groups, et cetera. And some of that came to UNSCOM because we were on the ground and we could collect data and so forth. I think, now I'm going beyond what I really know, on the Pentagon side, I think once they got dialed up in terms of priority, they then found that there wasn't a lot of experimental data that they knew. Beyond that, all I can tell you is that they spent a lot of time. They did a lot of reports on it. They did a lot of analysis. I'm not sure that they really know what the effects are now. It's also the case where there's a lot of toxic things which troops, weapons inspectors were exposed to include things from incinerators, getting rid of toxic, all kinds of industrial waste, as well as chemical precursors and final chemical agents. So to untangle all that, I don't know. I'm not the expert on it. I know they spent a lot of time on it. I wish I could give you a better answer.
Thank you. Please.
Hello, my name is Adam Schultz. I'm an undergraduate student at the Shar School. Mr. Morell and the ambassador already touched on the de-Baathification and the occupation, but what other big mistakes would you say were made in the post-war rebuilding of Iraq?
I would say taking so long to recognize that we were dealing with an insurgency and understanding it. I'd just stop there.
I'd be happy to chat with you longer, but there were a lot of things on the implementation of, whether we got too ambitious, whether the war aims expanded into, rebuilding institutions, and we didn't really always have the right people in the right jobs. But it's beyond intelligence, I think, your question, as I understand it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Travis. I'm a master's student at the Shar School, getting political science and international security degree. So my question is actually about Curveball. Why did the BND deny the U.S. direct access to him? And had the U.S. pushed that issue, do you think other outcomes would have been possible?
I'm sorry, why did?
The
Why did
BND not permit access to Curveball himself.
I don't think we know that to this day. What impressed us at the time was that they authorized the use of his material, and that's a whole story unto itself. What I can tell you is that when we were not able to meet with him directly, and I think their excuse was that they were trying to protect the security of their source, but also typically countries don't let other countries meet with their people they call the agents. We wouldn't do that either. So in a sense, they were culturally in tune with the way we would have operated. One of the things that the analysts did with the Curveball material, and there were probably 100 reports, is they gave them to an independent laboratory, engineering laboratory, to ask that the question, does this make sense? Would this work, the things he's talking about? And I'm sad to say the answer came back yes. So,
Michael, did you?
Yeah, there's another data point here too. Everybody focuses on Curveball, but there were 3 other sources. So there were 4 sources in total who said that there were mobile biological production labs. So Curveball was not by himself.
yeah.
Could I add something else?
Quick, yeah, sure.
Again, taking blame for much of this, we, UNSCOM, I think, kind of teed up some of this because we hinted, one of the things we were investigating was the potential, and we'd heard some references to this from Iraqis. We put this in our reports. Now, those who wanted to feed information which would support their cause, and without pointing fingers at the INC, the Iraqi National, they certainly have an interest. They could look at our reports and find out what we expected to hear. I don't know if Rafat Alwan, Curveball, I don't know for sure that he was coached by them, but it may well be the case because he told us exactly what we expected to hear, that there were mobile biological labs. It's also somewhat, an American did, well, no, I'll leave it at that.
Let's take 2 questions from this side. So let's have the 2 people in front. Please.
I just want to ask, so given that Saddam had a really hostile neighbor to his east, as well as a majority Shia population that he wasn't exactly on the best of terms with, it would presumably have been in his interest to basically seem as if he may have had more than he had in terms of weapons. Did the idea that Saddam might have been
Deceiving?
yeah, so given that he had to play to an Iranian audience and not just an American one, and that it might have not been in his interest to show what he didn't have. Did that possibility of Saddam's motivations factor into the U.S. assessment before going to war?
Interesting. Thank you. Let's get a second question.
Yeah.
I don't know,
I can do
Charles,
that.
you want to take that
I
one?
can do
Okay.
that.
Okay, hi. Thank you, gentlemen, for your discussion and your service. I appreciate it. I'd be curious to know what would have made the UN data more effective to go if we went back now. I'd be curious to know how de-Baathification actually became a policy, if it was opposed or against, as you said, policy. It has not been really analyzed, so I get it. But my question is the following. So in late 2021, there was a Reuters article published in which President Biden and President Zelensky basically said, there's going to be no compromise, there's going to be no negotiation. And at this point, nobody knows how that war is going to end. It's tragic. But I think similar to the Iraq war, it's cost more in terms of human life, in terms of capital, everything, than we previously expected. So my question is, do you think, looking back 20 years later from today, will they see this no compromise, no negotiation, kind of like Colin Powell saying, you're either with us or against us? Meaning, was there some way to achieve our ends in Iraq at a different cost, similar to maybe there's a different way to achieve our ends in the current situation in Eastern Europe? Thank you.
You want to take the...
On the first question, I think probably the honest short answer is that no, someone may have thought the possibility of Saddam making this up or deceiving or using it because he had to portray himself as having WMD to impress his neighbors, Iran in particular. I don't recall that anyone ever really dug into that or floated that hypothesis. And part of it was, why would that be the case? Part of it was, we had some sources who were very high in the Iraqi government, one in particular, who said, someone from Saddam's inner circle, that they not only had chemical weapons, but they had them loaded on launchers and ready to go. Now, it turns out not to be correct, but even, Charles may have something to add to this, even after the war, we were discovering senior Iraqis who thought they had weapons of mass destruction because no one knew who had them. In other words, I don't have them, but I know the unit next door does. So we encountered that kind of thing, which may have discouraged the analysts from thinking about deception.
And a variation on that was if the people that Saddam had designated to run the various units or R&D programs, would they have had the courage to tell the leader that actually the program wasn't in as good shape as they were supposed to, that were they feeding Saddam the illusion that his programs were in fact in good shape, when in fact there were some serious deficiencies. I think you guys have worked on that.
I mean,
Yeah.
wisdom comes late. We spent a lot of time talking to Saddam, and we asked him exactly that question, because he gave a speech in June of 2000, where he said, public speech, he said, you cannot expect Iraq to give up a sword and live only with a rifle if its neighbors don't give up their rifles and live only with swords. So to us, that sounded like Saddam speak, for he's hanging on to his WMD. So we asked him that in the debriefings, and he said, well, look, our default assumption about the United States is, this is maybe hard to believe, but the default assumption about us is that we're smart. They think if you spend $80 gazillion a year on intelligence, you probably really know what's going on. So nobody's going up to Saddam saying, well, yeah, Madeleine Albright says this and that, but they have no clue what they're talking about. So Saddam made clear that in that case of that speech, his target audience was, as you suggested, but we only learned this after the war, that his target audience was Iran. He wanted to create uncertainty and deter Iran, which at that point in time is firing rockets at them. So.
Can anybody take on the other question of, I guess a simple answer to that very interesting question would be that we never get right an estimate of what a war will cost before it happens. I mean, that from day one, the costs are almost always much higher than, so the question of what's a reasonable cost, and that is one of the justifications for just war.
The question is more structural. How do you create a situation where people are not allowed to run through barriers in terms of people are saying don't go to war, the international community says you're not allowed to go into Iraq, but we do it anyway. How do you create a structural system where negotiation and compromise come first and war is last resort?
Well, it's countries that make decisions to go to war. And, you know, in this case, one could have continued inspections longer. That was an option. You could have continued inspections and prolonged it, but one of the lessons out of this and a lot of things we do in the world is once you're mobilized and you have all these troops down on the border and inspections are going on, how long can you keep a military cocked and ready to go, saying, let's wait another couple of months? I think that was...
I'm just going to ask one question. When they went to the UN and Colin Powell said that, was it already a fait accompli?
He was trying to make the case. That was, what month was that? That was
February.
February.
February 5th.
It was not a fait accompli yet.
No.
No.
So I would...
Other countries at the UN.
Well, I would say, first off, we don't know. It's important that intelligence officers say when they don't know.
Yeah, very well said.
And my sense is, having made that case in February, the decision was not, it was leaning in that direction, but I cannot to this day pinpoint the moment when George Bush said, we're actually going to do this. Everything was, you know, loaded, but he still had to say go, and he hadn't said go yet.
I think, unfortunately, our last question is going to be from our former colleague, Jim Piffner, and then we're going to have to wrap up, I'm sorry to say.
It seems that in a lot of people's minds, Saddam's potential nuclear capacity was really important. So in 2002 and 2003, what evidence did you have that he had nuclear weapons? Uranium oxide was debunked by the CIA. The 25,000 aluminum tubes were marginal. So was there other evidence that he had a nuclear capacity in 2002?
No, this is an important question. And people need to, the mythology of Iraq has assumed that we were saying he had a nuclear weapons program. In the National Intelligence Estimate we did not say that he had a nuclear weapons program. We said that he was acquiring materials that could be used for a nuclear weapons program, but that it was probably 5 to 7 years away. We did not claim even that he was enriching uranium. We said he was acquiring materials such as tubes to spin U-235 to enrich uranium, but he hadn't done it yet. And the Energy Department vigorously disputed that those tubes were for that in a lengthy dissent, which is why it was surprising to us when U.S. senators got up on the floor and said, there's absolutely no doubt that Saddam will have a nuclear weapons program very soon. So that's one of the mythologies of all of this. We were, don't misunderstand me, the National Intelligence Estimate was wrong, and it was too assertive about it was too confident, to use Michael's term, but it did not say that he had a nuclear weapons program.
As you can see, there's still a lot of room to be digging and debating and trying to see if we can sharpen our understanding of these things. We're only at the 20th anniversary, so come back for the 25th anniversary and we'll give it another try. How's that, Larry?
Let me ask one question on behalf of the YouTube audience, because there were a few questions that circled around this arena. We talk about how we got analysis wrong on Iraq WMD. So there's a question that's been posed about accountability, particularly personal accountability. And I know that's an issue, clearly that, you, General Hayden, you, John McLaughlin, you, Michael Morrell, have had to deal with, when analysts get something wrong, how is accountability addressed?
Well, I actually give a talk on accountability in the course I teach, and accountability is pretty easy when it's a matter of malfeasance. Someone steals money, someone is on a, we've discovered once someone was taking kickbacks on a contract, that person was fired. That's easy stuff. It's harder when an analyst who is working, doing their best with incomplete information and struggling with deception and under time pressure, and they get something wrong, it's hard to hold them accountable in the same way that you hold someone accountable when they go through a red light. However, I know in the case of some of the mistakes that were made on Iraq, I don't know them all because I left in 2005, but one of the key analysts who made a major mistake now teaches a course, or taught for many years a course, at the analyst school that we have, Sherman Kent School, on what went wrong, what I did wrong, and how it can be fixed. In other words, we try and, if you get something wrong, we will oblige someone to make an effort to teach others how not to do that. Plus, at that time, the then Director of Intelligence, today we call that Director of Analysis, did something called a tradecraft stand-down, which meant that all of the analysts were taken offline in groups and put through an exercise where they were asked to lay out what are the assumptions that undergird their conclusions, and then to write something challenging those assumptions. They had homework. So that's how you deal with accountability. You don't simply say, fine, you got it wrong, have a nice day. You say, what went wrong here? How can we fix it? And you fight another day.
Analysts take risks when they make judgments.
All the time.
Incomplete information. They have 10% of what you need to fully understand an issue, and they're making a judgment. So they take risks. If you hold people personally accountable, no more risk-taking, right? And you shut analysis down.
Michael, how about when you talk to the president about Saddam, remember? And you say, just you and the president saying, is it right or wrong? Can you talk about that with the, he talked to the president and he said, so at CIA, what are they saying?
Yeah, I remember that. His concern, the president's, back to the very good point about 9/11 had just happened. The president felt, and I think he's right about this, right? The president felt that his #1 job was to protect the American people. And the president felt, and I know this because he told me, that he felt on 9/11 that he failed in his fundamental job. And the president's big concern was that it was going to happen again. And we were telling him that Al-Qaeda was trying again. And so he had that concern, but then on top of that, he had the concern that Saddam might share his weapons of mass destruction with Al-Qaeda. It's a deep, deep, deep concern he had, born of 9/11. And he wanted to know, what do you believe about weapons of mass destruction? And I told him what we believed. And I wish I could have thrown the low confidence in there.
Okay. Well, this has been a great panel. I want to thank Ellen for doing a masterful job at moderating. I'd like to thank all of our panel members here for taking time to come and revisit this issue that dominated significant parts of their career and it continues to take their time to have these kinds of conversations. I hope you walk away with a little more nuanced perspective on how intelligence works with policy. We got a nice reception across the way, great conversation. You've got more questions, you can pigeonhole these guys over in the room over there. Please exit the auditorium, allow them to then get a chance to go over. Don't come up and start crowding around asking questions now. Next Hayden Center event will be on the 10th of May, and we're going to look at climate change and its impact on national security, and why does the intelligence community call it out as a significant threat going forward in their annual threat assessment that they put out this year. So thanks a lot. Round of applause for our